ISW certainly has a major impact in policy circles.
Informative.
Extraordinarily useful.
Effective.
They're the best.
Founded by the sister-in-law of Robert Kagan and wife of Fred Kagan, Kimberly Kagan, the Institute for the Study of War did a brilliant job of removing itself from the tainted recent history of the neoconservative movement.
The question is, what do we do about the fact that there is a large al-Qaeda splinter group that has a terrorist safe haven right now in Iraq and Syria that can threaten us? We have to focus on that problem and stop feeling as though the decisions in 2003 are at the root of this problem. It doesn't matter. We have to deal with this crisis right now.
There have been several mentions of Richard Kagan. I wanted to point out the fact
Robert
that
Kagan, just FYI.
Oh, sorry, of course. That 10 to 12 years ago, he and his brother and sister, who were frequently on C-SPAN, were among the biggest promoters of the invasion of Iraq, which has turned into an utter disaster.
Kim Kagan, president of the Institute for the Study of War.
Is there, would you be a neocon?
People use that term, and I don't really know what that means. I don't define myself.
Does your husband?
No.
Are you a neocon?
I really don't know what that means anymore.
Let me start with a clip from December the 9th, 2005, when somebody named Kagan appeared on one of our call-in shows.
My brother is Bob Kagan, and there's another Kagan coming behind me, my wife, Kim Kagan.
What does she do?
I'm a military analyst and a military historian. I am the president of the Institute for the Study of War, which is a nonpartisan think tank here in Washington, D.C.
I'm joined today by my friend Fred Kagan, a fellow scholar here at the American Enterprise Institute and director of the Critical Threats Project at AEI.
Fred and I come at problems from our experience as historians and also our experiences at West Point. It really, I think, is unusual for a civilian to be able to see the fruits of teaching officership.
In southern Baghdad, right in the heart of it, we will get to that, certainly.
As I told you before we started, I want to try to connect the dots. And to do that...
if I was a casual observer reading the book for the first time, I would still have no idea the extent to which you yourself were involved in the search. You detach yourself well within the book, probably because you're a very humble person.
You're probably best known, if you ask someone on the street in Washington, Fred Kagan, architect of the Iraq surge. So that was 2006.
What, was your role in putting this together? Because it's more than just an academic exercise. You didn't build this in an ivory tower.
Ms. Kagan, you seem to be somewhat of an apologist for the administrations of past. I mean, Saddam Hussein allowed us to inspect. For 12 years, we went through sanctions and inspections, and Scott Ritter said there was no weapons. There was just so much conflict of interest.
Why do you do this?
Well, as you know, it is a cornerstone of our democracy that civilians actually have some very important decision-making power about military affairs.
The great thing about doctrinal terms is that everybody knows what they mean. So if I say the mission is defeat the enemy, everybody from the four-star general to the lieutenant knows exactly what is meant by that.
And in order for our democracy to flourish, civilian policymakers must be able to evaluate commanders, evaluate strategies, and make determinations about what our nation's overall policy should be.
What the Kagans do, actually, is they grade my work on a daily basis. And you think I'm joking.
Her career spent more than 17 months advising U.S. commanders in Iraq and Afghanistan.
I'm here to conduct an assessment for General McChrystal.
And as I stated, you seem to be an apologist rather than someone who's being somewhat honest, because the last question that the Twitter person had posed was the most important one. Thank you, C-SPAN.
Anthony, thanks for the call. And this from Jan, who says, what is our gain if we go into Iraq again? So to both of these points.
On August 8, 2011, the Institute for the Study of War, a think tank in Washington, was founded by a woman named Kimberly Kagan, hosted a dinner for General David Petraeus, because the Kagans didn't really exist in the chain of command, which meant that they could go directly to Petraeus. They didn't have to work through other layers of subordinate staff officers.
There is some suspicion that actually there's a hand up my back that makes my lips talk, and it's operated by one of the doctors Kagans.
Lawyers are examining the specific arrangement between Petraeus and the Kagans to ensure that it fully complied with those regulations.
I see deliberate enemy operations, which you can actually depict on a map, and I commend to you a terrific report by the Institute for the Study of War called ISIS Captures Ramadi, which actually has a military, old-fashioned military-style map showing the ISIS maneuvers because they are maneuvering.
The Institute for the Study of War monopolized the think tank industry in terms of U.S. war analytics.
Now at the map, the research director at the Institute for the Study of War and former U.S. Army intelligence officer, Jessica Lewis, who's an expert on ISIS. Jessica, you and I have talked about this before.
So involved in the day-to-day strategic battle plans of the U.S. military that their maps became a standard, appearing almost daily in U.S. media outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, Bloomberg, and even Mashable.
If you go back to earlier definitions, classic definitions of corruption, you see that they're often about violating the public trust.
When you heard that Obama was carrying this around, where were you and what was your reaction? What was your feeling?
Well, I was here in Washington, and I was delighted, of course, because no author is troubled by the fact that the president is reading his book. You can't get a better advertisement than that.
The ISW managed to plug themselves so deeply into the foreign policy-making brain trust in Washington, D.C., that hardly anyone noticed what their true motives might be. An obvious motive would be helping weapons sales, as the ISW was entirely funded by the biggest defense companies in the United States, like Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics. It seemed that Kim Kagan was even more successful in disassociating herself from neoconservatism compared to her husband Fred or her brother-in-law Robert. And in general, the ISW itself was taken more seriously than the Foreign Policy Initiative, which had already been coined PNAC 2.0 by critics.
And a lot of this Flexian activity really does violate the public trust. And that's what we should be concerned about.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
If you're just joining us, my name's Chris Griffin. I'm the Executive Director at the Foreign Policy Initiative.
Matt Duss, National Security Editor for ThinkProgress.org. He attended the Foreign Policy Initiative conference today. There are these guys here who said back in 2001 that Afghanistan's already won, mission accomplished. Then they made the case that we should go on ahead into Iraq. Those were the guys that were at this conference today. Does that mean that their conference was a whoops, we sure blew it apology conference?
Well, certainly not. What we need to understand, this is where I think Americans, and not just American people, not just the average voter, but even American policymakers need to understand foreign policy is hard.
There's never really been any accountability for these guys or any admission that any of their fantasies about transforming the world at the point of an American gun were kind of ridiculous.
You don't succeed most of the time. I say in the book, foreign policy is like hitting a baseball. You know, if you fail 70% of the time, you go to the Hall of Fame.
Yes, right.
And what we initially framed as the crisis in the Middle East at the beginning of the year, and as the year progressed, we modified the title to be the chaos of the Middle East.
There's really no admission that these ideas have simply been discarded.
Robert Kagan was saying that he does not consider himself a neocon anymore. He considers himself a liberal interventionist.
And as part of this project that they're now trying to rebrand themselves.
The Project for a New American Century was thrust into the spotlight. And although many think that the neocons lost power when Bush left office, these shady operatives have taken a cue from Blackwater and only rebranded themselves.
They've just kind of moved on to their new attempt to rebrand themselves as a bipartisan foreign policy organization.
FBI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that makes the case for American leadership and engagement in the world.
Look, my approach to foreign policy and the approach of this book is a bipartisan approach. It's one that presidents from Truman to Reagan have followed. So I'm glad to have both sides taking a look at it.
There is something of a bipartisan foreign policy tradition in the United States.
Well, I'll tell you,
you know, Obama shows no signs of being the kind of guy who holds a grudge.
He's post-partisan, man.
Kim Kagan, who is the founder and president of the Institute for the Study of War, an organization whose work I could not more highly recommend that you check out, and invaluable in our work.
It was kind of a reunion.
Thanks to those of you on our C-SPAN audience who are following along.
The theme of this year's forum, which is FPI's 5th, is Will America Lead?
I think you've had a long morning already, so we're going to liven it up a little bit on the stage here.
But surely the FBI was able to garner attention in D.C. with the involvement of people like Robert Kagan. Or was it?
Jointly hosted by the Foreign Policy Initiative, join me in welcoming Senator Tom Cotton.
Thanks to FBI and to AAF for hosting me this morning for the very important work you do. We have systematically underfunded our military. The result of this experiment should come as no surprise or little different than the results of the same experiment in the 1930s.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're welcome to be here.
The Code Pink protesters who crashed a nearly empty FBI event with Tom Cotton looked bored to death. One of them staring into her cell phone as she walked out of the proceedings.
What was his response? Yes, certainly, death to America. This is not the man or the regime to whom we should ever make nuclear concessions. And in fact,
in an accidental hot mic recording before the start of a foreign policy initiative talk.
How you doing? Edward Burrier. Nice to meet you. Thanks for again for
talking about stocks.
On short notice.
But these chairs, they're really nice.
Other people have notes up here. Yeah. I'm used to like more of a table. You guys good? Test my skills.
The host expressed disappointment that only 5 people are interested in this stuff.
I don't know. There's like 5 people who care about this stuff, and that's about it.
Well, these people here.
But a few seconds later, he uses his knowledge of the policymaking scene to explain to his staffer how he should get to know another staffer because they share mutual goals.
He's been trying to push something. You guys are pushing, but I figured, hey, he's young. He's been at the job for about a year and a half, 2 years. So, someone you usually don't know. Yeah, and vice versa, you know.
So maybe the FBI was influential among certain key people or policymakers, like Paul Wolfowitz, who is seen here attending one of their conferences.
And of course, Dr. Kagan is best known for
my team at the Critical Threats Project and the team at the Institute for the Study of War.
Fred Kagan was in charge of a wing at the American Enterprise Institute that featured regular writings by Thomas Donnelly and Gary Schmidt called the Critical Threats Project. In conjunction with the ISW, the Critical Threats Project released a series of detailed strategy guides on how to defeat ISIS in Syria and in Iraq. In what could be described as a PNAC reunion, these strategists found a home at AEI's Critical Threats Project. In reality, it wasn't necessarily about what think tanks these people belonged to. It was a matter of who these people actually were and how their ideas spread.
Tom Donnelly and Gary Schmidt, who have had distinguished careers here in Washington, in government and outside, in think tanks and other notorious institutions that we've worked together on a little bit.